Over the years, I've learned that difficulty and suffering serve us in positive ways when they peel away the layers of distraction that keep us from thinking about the things that really matter. Suffering and difficulty are great teachers. Dr. Carl Trueman believes that our current pandemic is doing us a favor by offering us a window into realizing that very few of us have been prepared well to face our own mortality. How can families, youth groups, and churches equip young and old alike to grapple with that gnawing, inevitable reality that we all work so hard to avoid? Stick with us for an encouraging, practical, and yes, winsome conversation with Carl Trueman and Duffy Robbins about the opportunity we now have to learn how to live in the shadow of our mortality on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm really excited about today because I've got one of my best friends on here to co-host, Duffy Robbins. Duffy, welcome.
Hey, good to be back, Walt. Thanks, man.
You've been locked in the house for what? How many weeks now? Since I saw you last, right?
My last day on campus was March 25th. That was the last time I had, some sort of just regular, normal contact with someone who's not Maggie.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So you guys, everyone's getting along there okay?
I'm even playing it safe. I've asked Maggie to stay away for another month.
Okay. All right.
Just kind of really hedge my bets.
That's good. That's good. Anything you need to do to survive. We don't want to lose you through this. So I'm glad you're here. And we're going to have a great conversation today. You know, with the coronavirus epidemic, we've had a lot of conversations here. It seems like that's what everybody's talking about. We've said here that people aren't really interested a whole lot in learning about youth culture anymore as much as they are in learning about handling what's going on in our culture. And we've talked quite a bit about
biological cultures.
The biological cultures, that's right. What's happening in the Petri dish. And what has been really interesting is the way God seems to be at work through this as we see this more and more with dealing with ourselves. I've talked in the past just about how my diversions have been cleared away, and that's given me eyes to see a lot more clearly what some of the idols in my own life are. It's really brought the scriptures to life for me as I've been reading every day. Conversations I've had have been really, really significant. I think that this has made us think about things that we need to think about. I know that's been the case for you as well. And there was an article that Carl Trueman wrote in First Things that popped up online, and we'll include a link to that at cpyu.org. If you go to the player for this particular episode of the podcast, you can read that particular article. It was just titled with two words, Deaths Delayed. Deaths Delayed. And you and I both read that, Duffy. I know you're working with Carl, teaching with Carl out there at Grove City. And what's great about this article, just a short little 3-page piece if you print it out, is it really makes you think about what we need to be thinking about and the kinds of things that God is bringing to light in our lives right now. And so we're going to welcome Carl. And Duffy, do you want to introduce Carl?
Sure. Carl Trueman is world-class theologian, historical theologian. He's kind of a polymath. He can pretty much teach on a wide range of topics. He came to Grove City the same year I did, a couple of years ago, from Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, and students really appreciate Carl's depth of thought, his ability to pose to them big questions, but pose those questions in a way that they can sort of understand them and realize the stakes. And that's exactly what he's done, I think, with this article, Deaths Delay. That was sort of my impression. I read it and I could say, yeah, this is why Carl Trueman's students at Grove City College really, really appreciate him.
Yeah. And Carl, we're glad you're here. Welcome. I do want to say one thing about Carl besides his books, and I know you have one coming out, a new one coming out towards the end of the year here that I'm very excited about on expressive individualism, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But you have the podcast, which we want to point people to, Mortification of Spin, which is a great podcast where Carl's he's a straight shooter. That's one of the things that I love about him, and he does it with a winsome way. Like, it comes at you and then it hurts, but it feels good. Does that make sense, Duff?
I'm generally shooting at myself. That's why it comes across as winsome.
I'm a listener to Mortification of Spin, and there's there's kind of the British, there's sort of an understated British capacity to say things that are pretty sharp edged, but in a way that you can't help but sort of chuckle or you sort of laugh a little bit. But it's also, like you say, I mean, Carl, that is kind of your I think that's part of the rap on you, is that you are a straight talker.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the podcast is mainly a bit of fun, really. I do it because I enjoy it. And the great thing about being British or English in America is you can say things and people say, oh, it's just that English quaintness or eccentricity, where if an American said it, you'd probably be fired and you'd be finished forever or something. So the accent is my key to survival, I think, by and large.
I think it's nice you recognize that, because we often say that someone with an accent like that can say absolutely anything and everybody hangs on every word.
I spent the first 5 years in the States just reading the telephone book in class, and I was getting great student reviews. So, it's...
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that.
That's awesome. Well, talk a little bit to us about this article. And I like the phrase here, about 3 paragraphs in. You write this: at some point, however, the COVID-19 crisis will be over, and the question for Christians will be simple: what should we learn from this?
Yeah.
That seemed to be a key to this, but go ahead and unpack it for us.
Yeah. Well, the article originated. Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things, called me on the Saturday morning before I wrote it to say that to ask me what my opinion on what was going on was, and whether the First Things approach that he was adopting was a good one, and he suggested to me that I take on board from a because he's Roman Catholic, so he wanted a Protestant perspective on what was going on. And as I reflected on it, I thought that there are numerous ways that Christians often approach these things. There are those who always attempt to read God's mind and say, well, the reason why God has done this is X, because we've sinned or because of abortion or something like this. And any one of those things could be true. There's just no way that we can know that because it's not revealed to us. And I think the book of Job is a sturdy reminder in Scripture that a lot of evil goes on in this world that we have no insight into why it's allowed or why it's happening. So as I was reflecting on that, I thought, well, if the church can't learn from this in terms of probing into the mind of providence, God's mind in providence, and working out why it's happened, maybe we should think about other things that we can learn from it. And my mind was actually chatting to a friend, Todd Pruitt, one of my co-hosts on the podcast, and he drew my attention to the passage where Jesus points to he makes reference to those who've been killed in the accident of the tower when the Tower of Siloam collapsed, and those Galileans who Pilate had clearly murdered, some kind of judicial murder had gone on. And he made the point, Jesus makes the point there, that these things didn't happen to them because they're a whole lot worse than you. And the burden of the Lord's teaching at that point is very much, you need to pay attention to the fact these people have died, because it's a reminder that you too are mortal. You too are going to die at some point, and you need to be making sure that your own house is put in order. And then I sort of thought, well, how would we connect that to the virus? Thinking, one thing we can certainly say about the virus is it's brought death a whole lot nearer to a lot of us than is typically the case. Most of us, we theoretically know we're going to die, but I think most of us practically assume it isn't going to be anytime soon. It certainly isn't going to be in the next month or two. Yeah. Well, COVID has really made it. It's made that less certain. I think there's nobody in America that can say with full certainty, I'm going to be alive in 2 months' time now. The whole proximity of death, it's closed in on us. And I think that's an opportunity for the church to think about how she preaches the gospel, to think about what her task is, and to remember that as much as the church, and I earnestly believe the church is here to teach people how to live, it's also here to teach us how to die. And that's a note that I think is, I won't say it's absent from the church today. That would be a very bleak assessment. But I think it's not a note that is typically struck in the church in the way that it would have been in times past, when prior to the arrival of antibiotics, death was a lot closer. Most people would have lost a parent or a sibling or a child by the time they reached adulthood. Death would have been a lot closer for most people. So that was the kind of angle I was trying to take, and just to remind people that the church isn't all about life. It's actually about death and resurrection.
Carl, oh, go ahead, Duff.
I was going to say, what strikes me about that as a youth worker is that what you described is even more pronounced in the world of adolescence, right? I mean, if we as adults think we're not, you had a great quote in there. You quoted Cicero, I think, and
oh yeah,
and that quote really kind of made me smile. That there's something like, there's no man, no man so old that he doesn't think he's going to live another year.
Yes,
and,
yeah.
And if that's true for adults, it's especially true for teenagers. And I remember myself in high school, there was a car wreck, and 4 of our friends, were gone. Just in my junior year in high school, just gone. And I think what stunned all of us is that it sort of occurred to us that night, oh yeah, we're mortal.
Yeah.
And in a way, I don't recall anybody at the time using it as a teachable moment. Maybe I was just around the wrong people.
Yeah.
But I guess what you're sort of suggesting, or what I heard in your article from a youth ministry standpoint, is that the church has a unique responsibility, but also a unique moment, a unique opportunity here to kind of help us recognize, oh yeah, we're mortal.
Yeah, I think if we just go back to business as usual after the coronavirus, then we will really have learned nothing from it. And for whatever reason this thing has been allowed, and as I say, we can speculate about till the cows come home and never come up with a conclusive answer. One thing we do know is it is a reminder of our mortality, and if we don't capitalize on that, then I think we've truly missed an opportunity. I mean, you and I, Duffy, of course, at Grove City College last year, remember the 2 high school kids who were killed on their way to a Young Life meeting hosted by Grove City students. And I was actually preaching, of all things, on the book of Job less than 48 hours later in chapel. And chapel was packed that day. You and I both know most of the kids don't want to be in chapel on a Tuesday, but there was definitely an atmosphere on that Tuesday that, oh yeah, I don't have to tell these kids that the book of Job is dealing with serious stuff today, because death has intruded on their lives in a way they can't avoid at this point. Kids younger than them who were alive 72 hours ago are now standing before their maker. And death does break in. And I think the church really needs to reflect upon what that means practically for the week-by-week ministry of the church after the virus is lifted.
Yeah, you talk about business as usual. If we get back to business as usual, and that's one of the fears that I have about myself, because I am seeing things about myself. I'm learning things about myself that I've needed to see, I've needed to learn, and I'm starting to talk to myself now, being old enough to know the pattern that, like Duffy said, I remember those times when, you would have peers die and suddenly you're faced with your own mortality and you're locked in grief. But a week later, it's life as usual. I remember forgetting that, somehow just and living the way I did before. So the fear that I have of that, how can we, I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I'm thinking out loud here. How can we begin to keep this
right
front and center, not in a morbid way, but in an encouraging way to get us to be thinking about this afterwards?
Well, I certainly think, you make a good point there about we don't want to be morbid. And in preparation for this podcast, I was thinking about, how do you teach young people about death? And there's a sense in which, I'm not sure that I want to be teaching 3 and 4-year-olds about death. They don't have the conceptual apparatus as an adult, it's hard enough to grasp your own demise, let alone as a 3 or 4-year-old. The Bible doesn't just talk about death, it also talks about life. So we definitely want to avoid the morbid aspects of it. I think that part of the solution, maybe a big part of the solution, lies with the church herself. And I was reflecting on how when we're bringing up our kids, they're both grown up and gone home. One of them's returned actually in recent weeks. He's now ensconced with us in the wildest of Pennsylvania. But our kids have grown up. But one thing that struck me as I reflected on them growing up was we always went to churches where there was a range of ages. So even though they'd be in the youth group, on a Sunday, they were with everybody. And when you've got a church with a spread of ages, people die. There are old people there, and old people statistically more likely to die than young people. If you're in a church for any length of time, they will become aware of death. I won't say as a natural part of life, but it's something that's on their horizon, not in a morbid way, but in a way that they learn that is where we're all heading. So I think part of the answer is to make sure after the virus, to make sure that the church is presenting a proper balance of human life to people. And that, on one level, is as simple as making sure that all of the ages worship together, that all of the ages socialize together in some way, that the young people, there are very numerous good reasons why young people should get to know old people. Both benefit from that. But I think one of the things is mortality, aging. These things become part and parcel of life in a way that if you have these kind of homogenous churches where it's all cool young people, it's very easy to forget about aging and mortality there. So part of the answer, I think, is in some ways we don't need to do anything special other than be what the church should be, and that is the gathering of God's people regardless of age on a Sunday.
I love that.
I was just going to say, Walt, in trying to respond to this, of course, every youth worker, just like we are at Grove City as professors, everybody is kind of making it up as we go to some extent. None of us said to ourselves 2 months ago, hey, we'd really be good at handling a virus. Let's go for it. We just with this, you deal, you get the hand that you're dealt and you play it.
You and I were sitting around saying we'd be brilliant teaching online. We just need an opportunity to do
it. Exactly. Let's do college education by looking in the hole in our computer. So youth workers, in other words, are in the exact same spot, and I know, because we all face this same tension. They're going, what can I do to serve my students and their families in this time? And of course, now during this time, and I hope we'll maybe get the chance to talk about this a little bit, is in talk about virtual worship, because in a way, virtual worship services probably move us away from the broad range of ages that you just said. As a church, we need to expose people to. But I think the almost for all the maybe for understandable reasons, the almost instinctive default response of most youth workers is go, I've got to ramp things up. I've got to really load up our online capacity, and almost as a distraction,
right, from
the death that is around us. And of course, we all understand that instinct, and there's probably a sense in which it has pastoral intent. But one of the words you used in your article was how easy it is to to kind of feel our responsibility is to distract.
Yeah.
And we have to kind of push against that intention, that instinct.
Yeah, and I think that's a function of the wider culture. It's without wanting to, and I really don't want to criticize. I know youth workers are doing their best at this time, so please, I don't intend this as a criticism, but the idea that we have to distract it's akin to the idea we have to entertain. I mean, one of the striking things my wife and I have noticed as we watch the news each day, and we've had these sections in the news about things that your kids can do, to keep them okay during the time of viruses. Not once have we heard somebody say, tell your kids to read a book. It's been very interesting that the kinds of, I would say, ideas put forward have generally involved entertainment or passivity of some kind. Watch this program, watch that program, have everything delivered to you on a plate. And when I hear you saying, youth workers are feeling this pressure, well, I can understand that, because there's a sense in which youth workers are competing with the world, and they're having to do it on the world's terms at this point, it's kind of a losing game anyway, because at the end of the day, I find secular entertainment better than Christian entertainment on the whole. The world does it a whole lot better. So I do think youth workers are up against it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should uncritically just play along with that game. And I think again, youth workers working hand in glove, hopefully with a more comprehensive ministry being put forward by the church as a whole, should be encouraging parents perhaps to get your kids to read a good book, get your kids to read the Bible a bit more. There are things that youth workers can be doing that don't involve online so much as they involve Christians, young and old, taking responsibility for themselves and actively doing something. That might be easier said than done. That's the theory. Whether it works in practice,
it's easier said than done. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Right. It shouldn't be our intent.
Yeah. The problem, of course, is a time of crisis is not a time to teach people about death so much, and it's not a time to change the church culture. You have to have the culture in place already that can handle these kind of crises when they come along. The one thing I think our church has done I'm now at that age where, my elder, Mark Graham, who's only like 3 years younger than me, Duffy, he calls me up to make sure Katrina are okay. And he says, and if you're worried about going out for your groceries, we get the young people to buy them and deliver them for you. And I said, Mark, I'm 53, man. I'm quite capable of going to the supermarket. But then I like that idea that we have a lot of shut-ins in our church. And what better way for the young people to serve them, and maybe to strike up at least an acquaintance, which when the virus comes off, these young people, not only have they done a wonderful work of charity towards somebody who needs help, but they'll know that person by name in the future and be able to connect with them more broadly in the church once the virus is off.
I love this. This is good. We need to take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk at some point, Duffy, about what you brought up about virtual gatherings. I'm really curious about Carl's thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great topic.
Yeah. And I'm guessing he may have a couple of thoughts on that. I just,
just a few.
And then I've got some other questions as well. So let's take a break. We'll be right back. How has the coronavirus pandemic and stay-at-home order affected your family? One of the many good things that has come out of this crisis is that families are spending more time together. In fact, families are rediscovering the joy of sitting down at the dinner table together to share a meal and time in conversation. And as we navigate the questions, fear, and anxiety that have come with living in this cultural moment, we realize that our kids are ripe and ready to hear the truths of God's Word. We've been given a great opportunity to nurture our children and teens in the faith. Here at CPYU, we've launched a family table talk initiative designed to provide your family with tools to help you dig deeper into and apply God's Word. We've recruited a team of gifted thinkers and writers to create several weeks' worth of family table talk daily devotional guides. The guides give you a scripture passage to read together at the dinner table, some commentary on the passage to spark your thinking, some questions to help you apply and discuss what you've read, and a short prayer to pray together. These Family Table Talk devotional guides are all free. To access them for download and printing, simply go to our website at cpyu.org, that's cpyu.org, and click on the link for these brand new Family Table Talk guides. Well, welcome back, everybody, to Youth Culture Matters. We're having a great conversation with Carl Trueman and Duffy Robbins, both on the faculty at Grove City College, and actually sharing a wall. Is that correct? Your offices are adjacent to each other? Do you share a wall? Or is it
a closet between us to buffer the loud rock and roll music that comes from Carl's office?
I've heard that.
They put the two smartest dressed men on campus next to each other. In
Carl,
in fashion.
What is your definition of smartest? That would be helpful to me here.
I mean dress smart. Not
that's what I mean.
Smart.
Yeah, I know. Well, we could talk
smart,
about that too if you
Duffy
want. But
and
the dressing,
I think, the fashionistas of Grove City College.
Well, I don't know that anybody's ever referred to me that way.
Well, actually, I think they put the two baldest guys together.
That's the reference that has been made.
Yeah.
Carl is a British guy. He does. He kind of always has the tie. Some of the other guys wear jeans. I've been known to wear jeans on occasion, like the days I'm there. And Carl never. He just always and he's really been discipling me and trying to mentor me. And do some, I think, remedial work in this.
Teaching Duffy how to tie a tie, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's great. It's been great.
Yeah. How's it going?
All right.
Well, he's got me. I'm up to a bow
I'm
tie.
asking Carl.
It's been very good for my sanctification. I feel I've become a much godlier man as a result of this.
Yeah, your prayer life and all of that. Oh, man.
No, Duffy's I love my Grove City colleagues, and really enjoy connecting with Duffy when he's on the odd occasion he's on campus.
Yeah. Now, he did say, Carl, I do remember him telling me this, that he was fascinated by, you do listen to a lot of music, correct?
I'm very eclectic in my music tastes. Yeah.
Yeah. So surprise us. Like, who do you really love to listen to?
I love to listen to everything from Renaissance polyphony right the way through. So I think my guilty pleasure would be Meatloaf. I'm a bit of a Meatloaf guy. I've not dared play Meatloaf on campus lest it shatter my image, but Meatloaf. Yeah. Well, I presume you're not recording this, are you?
Yeah, we are, and consider your image shattered. I need to tell you this. So you have been, Carl, this is a little trivia point for you. You have been to speak to the church that I'm a part of here in Lancaster, Westminster Presbyterian, the PCA church here in Lancaster.
Former student of mine is now a senior pastor.
Yeah, Chris Walker. Yeah, we've had him on the podcast. Chris is a great guy.
Chris and Kate are wonderful people.
So Chris, and by the way, he quoted you in his sermon on Easter.
He's a wise man. That doesn't surprise me.
It didn't go to the scriptures, but no, he did go to the scriptures. He did quote you from this article.
Oh, from that article. It wasn't sort of... You never guess what my idiotic former professor once said.
Well, he actually used a Cicero quote. But here's what I want to tell you related to music and Meatloaf. When we started to go to the church 30 years ago, when we joined the church, someone pointed out to me as this older woman walked past, said, "That is Meatloaf's mother-in-law." She went to our church. Yeah. You're stunned. I can see it in your face. You're speechless. You don't know what to say.
Incredible.
It's crazy. Meatloaf's...
I
still think Dead Ringer for Love is one of the great tracks of the early 80s.
Well, I'll just say this. One day I was listening to the Stones in my office. This is a band from antiquity. And Carl walks in and immediately begins to tell me about his favorite Stones songs. He said, I really like more of the early Stones than some of the later stuff. And then we start to talk about the fact that he and his son are going to go to because the Stones are going to be in Pittsburgh supposedly in June. And
not anymore, but yes.
Yeah. So, this guy is, and he's a rock and roll. He's a polymath. He could teach, of course, on music appreciation featuring Meatloaf, one of the great composers.
Polymath is code for a man of no taste or discernment.
Yeah.
I think.
But I do like that. That's where you went. That's what your confession was. That it was meatloaf. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I'll lay awake at night tonight now.
And you like Phil Collins too, right? Or didn't you say
Genesis?
Did you listen to Genesis?
I listened to some Genesis. Yes, yeah. Particularly the Phil Collins stuff. The earlier stuff was a bit too prog rocky for me, but I like the Phil Collins, the lighter stuff.
Okay. That's good. I like this. Now I could totally derail this now with music.
Yeah, we better get back to death.
Yes. So let's talk about that.
We're enjoying life too much at this point.
Yeah. So, Carl, here's what I want to ask you. As a church historian, and we've talked a little bit about how some shifts have taken place, in terms of how we talk about or think about or teach about death, how we do or don't. What are some of what have we lost over the course of church history that we need to regain, and point out some of the things that we've gained, some advances we've made that are laudable, that we can be happy with, that need to stick, that we need to continue to embrace.
Yeah, well, I think the big loss has been that sense of mortality. I've used this example a number of times in talks that in times past, and there's a church actually just down the road from me where this would be true, that to go to church on a Sunday you'd have had to have walked through a graveyard, and because populations were not that mobile, you'd have walked past the grave of granddad or father or mother or maybe a brother or sister or even a child. So you'd have been constantly reminded of the absence of loved ones even as you went to worship. And I think that the fact we now have churches without graveyards, that's not a bad thing in itself, but it's emblematic of that shift of how death more broadly in society has been marginalized, and particularly in the church. So that's certainly one thing. And I would also say that in the modern West, and this might be an odd way of putting it, but freedom of religion is a great thing. But practically what that means is there are an awful lot of churches competing with each other for members, for congregants. And that means the pressure to produce a gospel that is marketable and appeals to people is huge. And bottom line is, if you want to grow your church, death is not a particularly hot selling point for most people. Most people want to be not reminded of death, or maybe reassured that they're immortal. So I think there are reasons why the church has lost its sensitivity to mortality, some of which aren't simply the fault of the church, but a fault of the culture we live in. And for one, I want to say, I want to live in a world where there's freedom of religion, but that brings with it certain challenges that the church in ages past didn't have. In other words, now we're involved in a kind of free market of religion, and that puts pressure on the message we preach. Things that we've gained, I mean, obviously, would want to affirm the knowledge we now have of disease, for example, is a huge thing. And I was commenting in the break to Walt about the Book of Common Prayer. When you go to the Book of Common Prayer and look at the prayer for one laid aside in sickness, essentially the prayer could be summarized as, Lord, this sickness indicates this man is under judgment. Please help him to come to repentance. And on the one hand, I want to say that's certainly a note that I want to see struck to some extent, but I think it doesn't represent the best pastoral practice to go into a household where, say, a young father is dying of cancer with his wife and kids, and the focus is on, he's under judgment, Lord, bring him to repentance. I do think we have developed a pastoral sensitivity in many ways that was probably lacking in earlier generations. I hesitate. I qualify that by saying probably, because obviously I wasn't around then, and who knows the full range of things that was going on. But I do think that we have a more, the therapeutic dimension of our culture is not entirely bad. It has made us more empathetic to those suffering. I've often thought of the Elihu is a bit of a mystery at the end of the book of Job, because at one hand, everything I read by Elihu seems to be correct, and yet God speaks after Elihu's finished. And even though God highlights only the first three comforters and not Elihu for rebuke, God still speaks, which makes me think that Elihu spoke correctly, but he didn't speak the whole truth. And I wonder if the problem with Elihu was there was just no human empathy or sympathy for Job in his situation. And I think we probably do now have a church that is more attuned to being sympathetic to those who are suffering than in times past. So that would be something I would say is a definite gain. The danger is it overwhelms the other, but I think it's still a definite gain in and of itself.
Yeah, that's good. Let me ask one more question while we're on church history here, and then I'll take it over to Duffy. One of my friends, Kyle Hoffsmith, who we've had on the podcast, he texted me today after I had told him we were going to be chatting with you, and he said this. He said, ask Carl Trueman which person in church history youth workers should read and focus on learning from today.
Oh, gosh.
Kyle's a young youth worker.
Right. Yeah, that's...
I thought that was a great question.
That's a good question. I've not thought of it in quite those terms.
Boy, the silence.
I certainly think... Yeah, I actually think Martin, I was trying not to answer Martin Luther, because Martin Luther is usually my answer to any question about who should I read. One of the things that I think that is interesting about Martin Luther, and I know I did a little book on Martin Luther and the Christian life a few years ago, and I was struck as I was reading lots of Luther. Luther is fascinated by children. He has children of his own. Of course, he's the first significant church leader, really, who had children. He's the first reformer. He gets married. He's certainly the first catechist who had children. That's why his small catechism, is so wonderful, because it works. You just know that this is a father talking to a little child. You had to be a father to write that catechism. I think youth workers should read Martin Luther, because Luther has a number of things to commend him. One, he's solid on the basics of the faith, obviously. Two, he has this fascination with childhood and with children that leads him to make a lot of theological applications from that. He's constantly telling his congregants, you've got to be more like children. Children have this childlike faith in their parents, and we need that childlike faith in God. And thirdly, the other thing that Luther does is he doesn't patronize children. And I've often thought that, I mean, Duffy might correct me, but from a layman's perspective, it would seem to me that the real skill in being a good youth worker is somebody who can identify with the youth without patronizing them, and yet still be a figure that they look up to and respect. And I think that's very, very hard to do. I'm always in awe of my wife. We used to teach the 4-5-year-old Sunday school together. Well, she would teach it and I would just read the story. And my wife always had this ability to talk to 4-5-year-olds in a way that made it very clear she's kind of the adult, but came right down to their level. They weren't being talked down to in any way. And I think Luther provides some good examples of that. So that's my amateur off-the-cuff response. I tried not to answer Luther. I've abysmally failed. I send you to Luther to look at his how he talks about and to children.
Yeah, I like that, because I think sometimes we tend to err on the side of not giving our teenagers enough credit in terms of their ability to cognitively track with truths of the Scripture and the deeper things of the Christian faith. So that's a great answer, and Kyle will love that. Yeah,
I was just this morning I was teaching the Doctrine of God class, and we're working through a section of Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, which is pretty heavy stuff.
Now this is with the 4- and 5-year-olds.
Thankfully not. But we got to the point in the first question of the third part of the Summa, and Aquinas asks these two questions. He says, why didn't God become incarnate as soon as sin had happened, and why didn't he wait to become incarnate until right at the very end? And I pointed out to the students, those are profound questions. and he's going to answer them in a profound way. But I tell you, those are precisely the kind of questions that kids ask. You know, a kid will ask you in Sunday, a 5-year-old will say, why didn't God fix the problem straight away? Or why didn't he wait until the whole thing had rolled out and then act? So I think we err terribly if we underestimate the naivety of kids. Often makes them brilliant questioners of theology, quite brilliant, and they deserve to be treated seriously and not patronized.
You know, what you're saying there also reminds me, Carl, that those are also the kinds of questions that are often asked as if they're the first people to ever pose those questions.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about and we ought to do another podcast on this, Walt, but I'm thinking about the people who have deconverted. Because they've come to these questions and believe, I think, that they're perhaps the first people to pose these questions and have found no answers, or no one has even plumbed these questions before. And yeah, I think you're right. We sell ourselves short. I always tell my students that one of the big mythologies of youth ministry is that you're supposed to kind of act like a teenager, and if you do that, you're going to die young in youth ministry, because you can't sustain that kind of lifestyle. But I always, I say, look, you don't need to be a teenager to act like a teenager. You just need to be an adult who doesn't freak out when teenagers act like teenagers.
Yeah.
Which separates you from 98% of the adult population.
Yeah.
But I think that's a great point. Hey, earlier Walt this idea of virtual worship came up.
Yeah.
And that, again, everybody's wading into this because we're all trying to figure out how do we serve our people. We can't gather. It occurred to me there's probably not been a time in a long, long time, if ever, where there have been so many empty churches, so few people in a room gathered to worship. It's just unheard of. Obviously, there's some benefits to this, but I'd like you to affirm to those, speak to those, but I'd also like to know just kind of I'd like to hear your comments or observations. What are some of the possible downsides? What are you thinking about when you think about virtual worship?
Well, our own church here is now online. We've now had 4 Sundays of seeing the sermons. The sermons aren't recorded. There is a small gathering of the 2 guys doing the recording, the person playing the piano, and the preacher, and maybe 1 or 2 other people in the church building. But my wife and I have not been. We've gone on and done it online. I think on one level, I certainly think it's appropriate to be civically responsible at this point. I roll my eyes at these ministers who've decided to make this somehow a kind of First Amendment issue. I don't think this is, when we come to fight the First Amendment issue at some point, we want to do it on an issue that isn't like this. This is a silly thing. These people are just grandstanding, I think. Obviously, I don't think it's as good as the real thing. I think virtual worship, it's kind of, it's the best we can do at the moment. But one of the things that's come home to me actually is, wow, actually the physical gathering of the saints, it's an important thing. Bodies are important. I went out yesterday shopping, and for the first time ever, I wore one of these masks. I felt like we would say in Britain, I felt like a total tube wearing this mask, wandering around. But it suddenly occurred to me, I was saying this to students in class this morning, it suddenly occurred to me how much of interpersonal communication is facial expression. It's not words, it's the smile that comes with the words. I'm really not communicating with these people. So I would say virtual worship, it's a reminder to us bodies are important. It's a stopgap. If you were to tell me we're still going to be doing this six months time, at that point I'm going to start thinking, okay, what's the pastoral cost over against the civic gain here? At some point the balance is going to start tipping. So I think, I praise God that we live in an era where we can do these things during a time like this, hopefully on the basis that, another month or something and the the restriction will start to ease in some way. What do I miss? I miss seeing people. I never thought I'd say this. I miss having to drag my wife away because she's talking endlessly after church to people. I even miss that, because that's kind of nice. More than anything, I miss the Lord's Supper. I know that good Christians are divided on whether you can have the sort of the Lord's Supper virtually. I've not done a lot of thinking about it, but the current state of play in my mind is no. It's the Lord's Supper's a meal, and a meal involves being with the church in some way. So our church doesn't practice the Lord's Supper virtually. I'm in full agreement with that. Not a criticism of those who do. It's a kind of a view that at this point I hold provisionally, but I do miss that. I think the Lord's Supper, again, it's brought home to me. Yeah, the Lord's Supper, actually, you thought you had a high opinion of it, but actually it meant more to you even than you knew at the time. So that's what I miss. And even I suspect those who are sort of doing virtual Lord's Suppers at home simultaneously, I imagine it's not quite the same as being gathered with the saints that you know and love on a Sunday.
Can I ask it before we take a break, as a culture watcher, Carl, because you're very astute with this, do you have any sense of what will happen after everything's opened back up? And I know what our desires are for people to go back into the church and worship face-to-face with a body, but do you have any sense at all or any inkling about what might happen with folks? Like, you see these pictures that people put up like, okay, I'm ready to worship. And it's like these pictures, these selfies they put up that are not of the face, but when they're at the beach, and it's looking out over their bare feet and into the water, and now it's looking out over their Bible and their bedroom slippers and a plate of waffles and a cup of coffee, and I'm here to worship. Do you think, what do you think's going to happen with that? I mean, I know it's an unfair question maybe.
Yeah. I hope that most Christians, if not all Christians, will realize that the gathering together is important. I fear that some, maybe many, will not get that point. So I think the things that churches can do to positively and negatively to encourage that, you can stop live streaming your services, or you can make it password coded just for the shut-ins at your church. I think that streaming services has an ongoing significance for the elderly and the infirm who can't get out, but there are ways you can make sure it's restricted to them and not just to those who want to dodge services. And I would say to those who want to say, well, I don't want to go to church anymore. I'm just going to tune in to whatever big church is and get the preaching. I think I'd want to press them again on the death front and say, okay, so what about that day when you're lying in bed and this is the day you die? Are you going to just want to live stream a recording of a pastor? Or do you want a pastor there sitting by your bed praying with you? Do you want an elder that you know who loves you, who's cared for you over the years, who's been involved? Do you want him there praying for you at this critical moment? And I think most people, if they're honest, would want to say, I want a real person. You can't live stream pastoral care in that sense. Pastoral care involves facial expression. It involves touch. It involves sensing the person in the room. These are kind of intangible in some ways, but I think we all know, the tragic pictures of these people dying, some of the most tragic COVID stories have been, this person died and they couldn't have their loved ones with them. Well, extrapolate that to yourself 30 years down the line. Will you have any loved ones from church to be with you? Or will they just have been pixels on a screen kind of thing? So my fear is that we will see a certain shift away by some people towards online church. And I would want to urge them to think very clearly about what they may be losing in doing that in the long term.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good. Well, let's take a break. We'll come back, and I want to finish this out with picking Carl's brain a little bit on some practical responses that we can enlist here in terms of what it is we talk about and what we teach in the home and in the church and the youth group. We'll be right back.
If you enjoy listening to Youth Culture Matters and would like to support the ongoing efforts of this ministry, you can do so by visiting cpyu.org/giving to make a donation. Your prayers and financial support make this podcast possible.
Welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. We're glad you're listening today. Our guest is Carl Trueman, and my buddy Walt Mueller, who is heading this operation, is here with us. And Carl, one of the questions that I wanted to pose, Walt was talking about, we come back from the break, some of the practical pastoral questions. And of course, even with your, wisdom and, background, everything, there's a limit to how much you can answer some of these questions. But if you are a youth pastor today, I mean, one of the questions that strikes me is that I don't want to deny mortality. I don't want to deny the fact that we can die, but I also recognize that for my young people, there are just natural fears that I don't want to instill or stoke about, my mom or my dad dying, because what's going to happen with me, and so on the one hand, I want to help them to look straight forward at the possibility, actually the inevitability of death, but I don't want to have them. I don't want to give them more stuff to be worried about and to fret over. Yeah. So how do I maintain that balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. As you were asking me that during the break, my mind went to a classic of Puritan piety, actually, of the 17th century, Lewis Bailey's Practice of Piety. And I remember there's a passage in there when he says that every night when you go to bed and you wrap yourself in your sheet, you should meditate on the fact that one day you'll be wrapped in a winding sheet and laid into the earth. And there's this sort of, wow, every time you go to bed, you got to think about the fact you're going to die. I'm thinking that's morbid. And when you come to children, I think children have to be handled very carefully on these kind of issues, and young people as well. And you rightly point to the tricky balancing act that's got to be achieved between, on the one hand, being realistic, on the other hand, not being the equivalent of a sort of video nasty, if you like, and terrifying the kids. Again, I'd want to step back and say, sorry?
Could you explain that term to Walt?
Video now, they're the old movies that these movies were so terrifying they couldn't even get general release. They went straight to video. They were kind of awful. I think, again, I want to step back and say, all the teaching about death has to be set within a balanced and broader teaching about the gospel, and clearly an emphasis upon the love of God, the sovereignty of God, the power of the resurrection. I think those are basic foundation blocks that need to be put in place for helping with discussions about death. I think when somebody has it drilled into their minds that God is loving and sovereign, that should diffuse some of the fears we have. Secondly, I think often Christians feel, and young Christians sort of, there's this kind of vicious circle, it seems to me, there they fear death, and then they feel guilty about fearing death because they shouldn't fear death because they're Christians. And at that point, I think Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus is, it's a tragic but beautiful scene where Jesus weeps. A friend pointed out to me recently that the first account of weeping in the Bible is when Abraham loses Sarah. We're told that Abraham went and wept for Sarah. Nobody weeps for Abel. No, we're not told anybody weeps for Abel, but Abraham's the heir of promise. He's the guy who's got more reason to hope, if you like, than anybody else on the face of the earth. And he's the first man we hear about weeping for his wife. And Jesus weeps at the tomb of Lazarus. So I think another thing we'd want to say to young people is, when you think about these things and it frightens you and it makes you sad, that's okay. You shouldn't feel guilty about that, because Jesus himself does that. And then thirdly, I'd say, rather than accenting death all the time, use those opportunities when death does intrude on a young person's life to talk to them about what's gone on. If they're very young and granddad's died, talk to them about how granddad's now in heaven with Jesus. And we feel sad that he's gone, and that's okay, because Paul says we mourn. We don't mourn those who don't have any hope, but we miss granddad. We're made less by the fact that he's not around anymore. But we know he's with Jesus, and one day we'll be joining him. So I would say there are various sort of strategies and ways, but fundamental to them all is a good, solid grasp of the love and the sovereignty of God, because that is the foundation for relativizing the fear, the anxiety, etc., that comes from all of these other things. Does that make sense?
Really good.
Oh, yeah. Carl.
And sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it might look different in different families, because every child is different as well. You can't say, follow the 12-step program and you'll get there. Parents have to be wise, I think, in how knowing what the child can take and what the child needs.
Yeah. We had, I mentioned that just 2 weeks ago, my dad went to be with Christ, and we had time to really prepare for this. His slide, out of life into eternity was a little bit longer. We had some days, so we were ready for this. And of course, with this pandemic, we were not allowed really to be in there, only one at a time, and we haven't had a chance to have anything afterwards. But and now we're quarantined from our kids and our grandkids. But I'll just share this. So we got on FaceTime, and my wife was on the day that my dad went to be with Christ, and my little 6-year-old grandson came up to the camera. He was in his backyard there in Philadelphia playing, and he comes up to the camera, and he says to my wife, he says, how's Grandpop? And she says, well, Nolan, Grandpop died today. And he said, well, if he died today, that means he's alive with God. And I just thought, and then he went on to play. And I just thought, that's a great perspective that they've taken the time and we've taken the time to talk about that and prepare them, and for them to be able, like you said earlier, Carl, to grasp difficult things that really are a mystery in so many ways, that give kids credit for that. So I was going to ask, you just said that different families and parents and youth workers can do this in different ways. Have you any good advice for us, in terms of some specifics right now? Families have more time. I know families who have children at home and they're doing homeschooling and they've never done that before. They're at their wits' end, many of them, and they're busy, and especially if you're working at home as well. But at least you have opportunities to not rush out in the evening to all these different activities. You maybe are sharing a meal together. Any suggestions?
One of them is going to be share a meal together. I was struck recently that some report came out, read some article somewhere that American architects now are not designing houses with dining rooms anymore because nobody sits around a table and eats. And I think that's a tragic loss, because eating is more than about sustaining life. It's about building community. And I think this, as grim as this time of quarantine is, it is an opportunity to build family. It is an opportunity to spend time with each other. My wife and I, we're not particularly busy people. We do spend a lot of time with each other anyway, but it's been a great time for us to sit around of an evening. There's no pressure to go out anywhere. We can talk. We can have a glass of wine. We can listen to some music. We made a point with my son being home that we sit at the table and eat together. I'm wearing a tie today. Duffy will be like, why am I wearing a tie at home? Because I'm trying to keep a routine. You spend all day in your pajamas, I suppose. But keep routines, be disciplined about the way you approach things. None of that's particularly spiritual. One could add a spiritual dimension, say maybe it's a time for family prayers, a time for reading the Bible together, time for encouraging your kids to read a book rather than watch a TV program or play a video game. Not that those latter things are necessarily bad. I enjoy TV programs myself, but it's also an opportunity to do something different. Don't see this just as a total setback. See it as an opportunity to do things you might not otherwise have an opportunity to get to.
Yeah, we may never have a time like this again. I really think in many ways it's beautiful, and I have heard some people say, this is like in the old days. This is what our grandparents experienced, and it's a beautiful thing. And I always think that especially with kids, I say this with them with their screens. They're locked on these things all the time. And when a youth worker says, hey, we're going to put them down for the evening while we have our Bible study, or we're going to put them aside for the weekend, they may
the blood
scream.
pressure rises.
Yeah, they may scream, they may moan, they may get hysterical.
Yeah.
But once they experience that and they start to live into what it is that they've been made for, they love it. And I've never heard a youth worker say yet, boy, I did that. We pulled them away. I did that. And they just said, stop, get me back with the phone. They loved it. And I think the same thing as we rediscover each other with our families. So I've got one more question because we need to end, but I just need to throw this in because as soon as you said you're at home at night listening to music with your wife, I'm wondering, does she like meatloaf too? Is that
no? She's
okay.
not a meatloaf person. She's more of a. She's actually from the Western Isles of Scotland. She loves Gaelic folk music.
Okay.
So we listen to a lot of Gaelic singing.
Yeah.
And we can meet on Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. So we will. She'll tolerate my Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin habits.
Really great Celtic singers. Yeah.
You are very eclectic in your music taste. I'm telling you, this is going to take me. I'm going to have to process this. It's more than Duffy. I'm constantly trying to nail Duffy down on his playlists, and when I'm in the car with him. And
Walt wants me to like these '80s guys, and I'm just not there.
'80s is tough. It's
the
guy, the two guys that.
Hall and Oates.
Yeah, Hall & Oates. Yeah.
Well, that's Philly. That's Philly. That's what.
That is Philly. Yes. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. So, Tom Petty I could handle, but Hall & Oates no.
Well, dare I say publicly? Oh yes, I will. You're criticizing me about trying to push you into the '80s music, and you got that crazy song stuck in your head, "Morning Train," and you and Maggie were beating your brains out trying to figure out who that was, and you asked me. You start to sing it. And I said, yeah, Sheena Easton, Morning Train. And you said, that's it. Now it's in heavy rotation for you, which is utterly disturbing to me.
Sheena Easton, there's a rave from the grave. She's a Scot, Glaswegian, I think.
That was a real breakthrough because I'd been humming the song and saying, Maggie, and I said, wait a minute, I know what I'm going to do. And I was in the car. I said, I know what I got to do. I'm going to call Walt right now. I call Walt. Walt goes, oh, it's Sheena Easton, Morning Train.
Well,
shame on you for knowing that.
That's what I was just going to say, but
way to just completely dismantle all credibility that might have been assembled during the fight.
Yeah, it's just all falling apart on all fronts. By the way, let me just say on all fronts. So, hey, Carl, I'm going to ask you one more question here. So, if we're going to sit down, and this is for me, all right, we're going to sit down and we're going to read a book aloud with our children, what would you recommend?
Oh, wow.
I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but,
Yeah. The book I most enjoyed reading to my boys, actually one of my favorite books of all time, but it contains a lot of English dialect, so it may not work in America, is A Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines, which is one of the saddest stories you'll ever read. It's about a young boy growing up on a poor estate in the north of England, and he discovers freedom when he finds a kestrel, and he trains this kestrel to fly, and he finds freedom. My boys love that. That and the poem The Highwayman. The poem The Highwayman, that I had to read them again and again when they were kids. Those are my two favorites, I think. Kestrel for a Knave and The Highwayman.
I will guarantee you that those two recommendations are recommendations that probably anyone who's listened to this podcast has never accessed, and now they can. So that's good. I love that. Don't recommend something we've read, but you've picked my interest now as well. So
they made Kestrel for a Knave was made into a very low key but very good British movie, Kes, Kes. That's available, I think, on Netflix or Amazon. That's worth watching. It doesn't contain the whole book, but it's a real tearjerker of a movie.
Okay. Well, that's a good recommendation as well. Final words, Duffy, anything you want to leave us with here today?
Well, I just want to say that, I am praying for our friends who are youth workers,
yes.
Because this is such a difficult time. And I know that you want to love your students, you want to disciple them. but I also, at the same time, want to encourage my brothers and sisters that what we're doing does shape their understanding of the faith and what good news is about, and also that the good news is big enough that it even embraces the bad news. We don't need to distract them from the reality of the bad news because God's big enough to go into an empty tomb and pull out of it life. So yeah, I hope we can cling to that.
Carl, any final words?
I think I've said enough. I've told you just about everything I know about everything today, so nothing else to add.
That was great. That was really fun having you here, though.
Yeah, and I will just say,
thanks.
What Carl just said is not true, and that's why we want to send you to check out. You can find him online. There's YouTube videos with Carl. There's a great old debate about that he had with some pastors about celebrity culture. Sorry if I'm bringing that up, but that was great. I loved that. The conversation you had with those guys.
They never asked me back.
Oh, you'll get asked back here. But so that was good. And then, certainly Carl's books and his podcast, Mortification of Spin, is a great podcast to listen to as well. So you'll get a lot more of Carl than what you got here, and it's in the same vein that winsome and fun and great thought-provoking truth. So we're grateful, Carl, that you're on here. I would just say to youth workers and to parents that it just seems like with what's going on now in our culture, the soil is really fertile and ripe for the gospel, and to teach the truths of the Scriptures about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, to talk about the cross, and to instill in our kids that hope of life after death, that hope for eternity. And I really, Carl, I appreciate you writing the article for First Things, Death's Delayed, and I'll just mention as we sign off here to everyone who's listening, go to cpyu.org. If you're listening where you normally get your podcasts, you won't have the connections to all of the links that Chris Wagner will put up under our player. So if you listen elsewhere, come over to cpyu.org after you're done listening and scroll down, and you'll find links to everything that was mentioned here, including the poem and the book that Carl mentioned at the end. We will find that. So blessings to you all, and thank you for joining us. We'll chat with you next time on the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.